This is FlappyBoid Chapter 5. We want to create some kind of background for our game. Now, I've done something specific that I hope provokes a little bit of thought in terms of the game design. There are two ways to approach this. We could actually move the bird to the left or to the right and just have the pipes spawn as the bird approaches them. Or we can actually have the bird hold still, just bounce up and down, and move the pipes. The difference is if we start moving the player and the camera's following the player, sooner or later we're going to run out of playable terrain because our terrain size is finite. And of course, the bigger the height map, the more demands it makes on the resources for the engine. So we wouldn't want to have to use a 16-kilometer height map just to make a very simple side-scroller game. So it actually makes more sense for the game design to move the pipes instead of the Boid. One of the challenges that's raised by that particular approach is that there's nothing to convey a sense of motion to the bird except the movement of the pipes. So what would be helpful is to have something moving in the background relative to the bird to enhance the illusion that the bird is actually moving to the right, in my case, if you look at the layout of the game. So CRYENGINE has fully volumetric procedural clouds, and I'm just going to show you how to turn them on for now. We're not going to use them until later in our game development because there's more complexities to using them, and I also want to introduce the designer tool and animated textures and some other concepts. The console is a tool that lets you talk directly to the engine. There are some things, in fact, that you can only access through the console, and there are thousands of cVars or console variables. If you type the word clouds, for example, you may be able to figure out that what we're interested in here is the procedural volumetric clouds, and the name of that particular console variable is r_volumetric clouds. It's not case sensitive, by the way. When you're new to these things, you don't know what they do, type it, put a space, and then put a question mark, and hit enter, and you'll see the possible values and what they do. So you see that you can enable them at half resolution or at quarter resolution. I'm going to turn them on, and an easy way to repeat the last cVar is simply use the up arrow key, and in this case I'm going to replace the question mark with a 1, and suddenly we have beautiful clouds in the background. So there are a lot of settings for these things, including the altitude, the density, whether they respond to wind, all sorts of things. But that gets us deep into the environmental settings, and so I'm not going to use them for now. Just in case you're wondering why am I creating sort of cartoony clouds, it's really to introduce some concepts that are useful for all game development. So what I'm going to do is move my camera to something like this, kind of zooming way back, and I'm going to actually draw a box. And I'm going to put a moving cloud sort of cartoon background on it. And if you saw the YouTube video, you'll know what I'm talking about. So the box needs to be quite large so that the camera doesn't see the edges of it. I'm going to keep my grid snap on and set to 1 meter increments. And I'm going to introduce a new tool, which is Designer. And it's down here in a separate group. And it's listed twice, which is frankly a little bit silly because if you get to one, you're going to get to the other. The UV mapping is a part of this. And I'm interested in drawing a simple box. So I activate my box modeling tool, and what I want to do is click and drag and watch my coordinates here. From having built this a couple hundred times, I know I want to make it about 150 meters and quite skinny. I'll go for about 1 meter, and then I'm going to let go of the mouse, and now I'm controlling the z-axis, the height of the box. A little tip here, if you run out of space, you can't see up here, remember that you can grab the right mouse button and tilt the camera up so that you can see where you need to go. So I'm going to make it about 150 meters tall, and I've got that. One more left click, and now I'm done making the box, but it's a little bit tricky to get out of this designer mode. Remember I pointed out how the Create Object tool worked when you double-click before? Well, the designer one is even a little bit more picky. It continues drawing entities, so if I start clicking and dragging again, I'm going to make more boxes, and they're all going to be grouped together. So it's really important to get used to this step of closing the designer tool, so I'm no longer modeling. And now for the first time, I actually see my box. I'm going to use my Control F1 key to get back to this position, and F11 for full screen. I've got my box selected, and I can see that probably it needs to move to the left. I know I'm going to end up creating a camera something like this that zooms in, so I can only see a couple pipes at a time. I'm inserting a tip here that I should have shown in the original video, but forgot to do. And that's how to set this perspective viewport aspect ratio to 16:9 rather than trying to guess at it and worry about the way that the tools change its shape. So just go to the camera menu, into the resolution screen and choose one of these 16 by 9 shapes. I would just choose the lowest resolution one. And I'm going to grab my box and I'm just going to slide it this way on the x-axis quite a bit. And if I go and check my full screen, it looks pretty good. I don't see anything like the edges of the box. If I go ahead and pull back, I think it's going to cover things pretty well. Obviously, I've made it oversized, but that's okay. Now we need to assign a material, and the material that we need doesn't exist, so we're going to create one from scratch. We have supplied you with a simple kind of Simpsons cartoon cloud background texture, and all we need to do is assign it, tile it, and animate it. For this, we're going to be using the Material Editor Legacy. For now, I'm going to go ahead and dock this over here. I may need to give it a little width. And what I want to do is actually go to my Materials folder here, and I'm going to add a new material. I'm going to make this a bit wider so I can see my buttons here. Right here is Add New Item. Go ahead and click on that. And I want to save this in the Materials folder, even though it's kind of specific to this game. It's not so specific to this box. Maybe I'll use it later. So I'm going to keep it in this general materials folder. And I'm going to call it Moving Sky BG for background. Next thing I want to do is actually assign a texture map. So if you come down here to texture maps, I want to open this diffuse sky here because I'm going to be doing a lot of editing. Click on this little browser button. And we want to go to Game SDK Materials. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you will see one file in here, which is cloudtiling_diff, which is a TIFF file that we prepared in Photoshop using the Photoshop plugin. We have not yet assigned this material that we've created. So the next step is to go to this button right here in the Material Editor Legacy and push the material that we've just made onto the object that's currently selected. So we assign the item. You'll see a little difference in color here. But unless you're close to this thing, it's going to be hard to tell what's really going on. So let's click in the perspective viewport and zoom in, and you will see if you zoom in enough that we have lots and lots and lots of clouds because the tiling is really crazy scale. So I'm going to zoom out to something like the view that my game is going to show, something like this, right? And just adjust the scaling so that the clouds sort of make sense. And for that, we need to open up this tiling parameter here. And what we want to do is set both our horizontal and vertical tiling to a much smaller value. I'll try something like 0.05. That's still too small. It's getting there. I can live with that. So there's our tiling. The next thing we want to do is animate these things on the x-axis, which will be our U value. For that, we're going to open up our oscillator settings. And the first thing is we need to tell it what kind of movement we're going to do. We're going to do a very simple constant movement. And in order to actually see some movements, we have to set two things. We have to set a rate and an amplitude. Amplitude isn't really relevant for constant moving, but we still have to give it some non-zero value. So since we have no idea, we'll just try a 1 first of all, like this, and see what kind of movement we get. It's not a bad start. It may be a little slow. This is going to depend on the size of your box. So if you're not seeing exactly what I'm seeing, don't worry about it. Just adjust these numbers until you're happy with it. But that's it right now for the texture. However, if you step back and take a look at this, I'm sure you can see that there's something a little funny about this. If we go back to the folder where this material actually is and take a look at this TIFF file, I'm going to go ahead and preview it. This is what it actually looks like, and this is what we want it to look like even in the 3D environment. But it really doesn't look anything like this. If we go back to CRYENGINE, the reason it looks this way is because complex shading is being calculated, including casting shadows of the pipes on the box. And what we want is a simple, just cartoon image. We want it to look in the 3D world exactly the way it looks as a 2D image. And for that, we need to use a much more simple shader. So if we scroll up to the top of our material properties list here, under material settings, what we want to do is change the shader type. So I'm going to click on this list, and instead of the default alum, I want to choose something called reference image. And lo and behold, suddenly we see a version of the cloud image that looks exactly the same as it does in a 2D world. And the way that this is accomplished is the shader is as simple as you could possibly imagine. It specifically removes all the lighting and shadows. I'm just going to say that again. It removes all the lighting and shadows. This is going to become really important later and introduce a set of challenges that we will fix later on. So we've used CRYENGINE's internal 3D modeling tool that we call Designer. It is by no means intended to replace a full-fledged modeling tool like Maya or Max. We use it mostly for whiteboxing, just to quickly throw together the elements of a level. However, if we end up creating a model that we actually want to use in the game, there's one key thing that you need to do, and that's export it and re-import it as a real CGF or OBJ file. And the reason is simply that Designer does not really produce optimized entities in terms of the number of vertices, etc. So to do that, we need to go back to our Designer tool. I'm going to select my background box here. I'm going to go to the Advanced tab and the Transform section and click on Export. I already have my box selected. I'm going to export it as a CGF file. I'm going to put it in my Objects folder under Props, FlappyBoid, because it's kind of specific to this game. I've already done this before, so I have it here already. And I'm just going to call it Background Box. Next, I'm going to delete this. If you were nervous about deleting it, you can hide it just by clicking on this eyeball column here in the Level Explorer. Don't forget to close the Designer tool after you're done with the export. And then I'm going to select this thing and simply delete it. And now I'm going to re-import the actual CGF file just as a normal brush. And again, Objects, Props, FlappyBoid, and what I'm looking for is Background Box. And then I'm roughly going to get it into position, and I'm going to put it right behind the pipes so that the camera angle doesn't start to see its edges. Since I've removed all shadows in there, it's not a big deal. There's nothing to clue the viewer about how far away it actually is. I'm going to use Control F1 to get to that view that I saved and just check it and zoom back a bit and just make sure that there's no chance that I'm going to be seeing this thing. And that's it for Chapter 5, adding a moving sky background.